The chainsaw tore through her ribcage like wet cardboard as the hurricane winds howled outside, but she kept screaming my name even with her lungs split open and flooding with rainwater pouring through the shattered window. Hurricane Delilah had been tracking toward the Gulf Coast for 5 days. Category 4, they said, maybe strengthening to Category 5 before landfall. Mandatory evacuation orders for everything within 50 miles of the coastline, but some of us couldn't leave. Some of us had business to finish before we could run from the storm. Lisa had been threatening to expose everything. Our arrangement, the photographs, the money that had been changing hands for 3 years. She'd gotten greedy, wanted more than our original agreement, started making demands that would have destroyed my marriage, my career, everything I'd built. The storm gave me the perfect opportunity. Power outages, communication breakdowns, emergency services overwhelmed. Who would investigate one more hurricane casualty when hundreds of people were dying in the chaos? I'd invited her over Tuesday night. I told her we needed to discuss new terms, negotiate a better arrangement. She'd arrived soaking wet from the torrential rain that had been falling for hours, designer heels clicking across my hardwood floor as she shook water from her umbrella. "This is madness, David," she'd said, looking out at the palm trees bending parallel to the ground in the ferocious wind. "We should both be evacuated by now. This storm is going to kill everyone who stayed behind." She was right about that, but wrong about who was going to die first. The chainsaw had been in my garage for 2 years, purchased for cutting up fallen trees after the last major storm. I tested it that afternoon while she was getting ready, made sure the chain was sharp, the fuel tank full, the engine tuned for maximum efficiency. When she turned away from the window to face me, I was already pulling the starter cord. The engine roared to life with mechanical hunger, drowning out her confused questions about why I needed power tools during a hurricane. The first cut caught her across the stomach, not deep enough to kill immediately, but sufficient to open her up and let the blood flow. She stumbled backward against the window as rainwater poured through cracks in the glass, mixing crimson with clear liquid in patterns that looked almost artistic. "David, what are you? Why are you?" she gasped, pressing her hands against the wound while her intestines began to spill between her fingers. But I wasn't finished. I couldn't be finished until she stopped being a problem permanently. The second cut went higher, across her chest, through ribs that snapped like kindling under the spinning chain. Blood sprayed across my living room walls in arcs that painted everything red. Furniture, carpet, family photographs that would need explaining later. But she kept talking, kept trying to reason with me even as her lungs filled with blood and rainwater from the storm outside. The hurricane was so loud now that her screams were barely audible over the wind, which was perfect for my purposes but horrifying for reasons I couldn't explain. "The photographs," she gurgled, blood frothing from her mouth as she tried to form words. "Hidden. Safe place. If I die, they go public." I brought the chainsaw down again, this time across her throat, but instead of severing her head cleanly, the blade caught in her spine. She made a sound like a broken garbage disposal. Wet, mechanical, inhuman. While her body convulsed in ways that defied anatomy, that's when I noticed the rain coming through the window wasn't clear anymore. It was red. Thick, viscous red that splattered against the broken glass with sounds like meat hitting pavement. The storm outside had turned crimson, as if the entire hurricane was bleeding. Lisa's body should have stopped moving by now, should have gone limp, become a corpse I could dispose of when the hurricane passed. Instead, she was reaching for me with hands that ended in exposed bone, fingers that had been stripped of flesh by the chainsaw but somehow remained functional. "You can't kill what's already dead," she whispered through a throat that had been reduced to hamburger and cartilage. "You can't hide what the storm remembers. The red rain intensified, pouring through every opening in my house now. Windows, doors, vents, cracks I didn't know existed, but it wasn't washing the blood away. It was adding to it, creating pools of crimson that reflected images I didn't want to see. In those bloody puddles, I could see other scenes, other rooms in other houses during other storms, other men with chainsaws standing over other women who'd threatened to expose their secrets, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all making the same choice I'd made, all learning the same horrible truth about what happens when you try to bury your sins in hurricane graves. Lisa pulled herself upright despite injuries that should have been fatal. Despite having most of her torso carved open like a Halloween pumpkin, the chainsaw had gone silent, not out of fuel, but clogged with so much flesh and bone that the chain couldn't turn anymore. "The storm collects us," she said, her voice coming from everywhere at once, from the red rain, from the bloody puddles, from the wind itself as it screamed through my shattered windows. Every hurricane, every storm, every time someone thinks they can hide murder in the chaos. She was right. I could see it now in the reflections around my living room, an endless procession of hurricane victims who hadn't died from wind or flooding, who died from chainsaws and knives and bullets fired by people who thought natural disasters provided perfect cover for unnatural crimes, all of them collected by the storm, preserved in the eye of every hurricane that had ever made landfall, carried from coast to coast as part of the weather system's permanent memory. Every time the wind howled, they howled with it. Every time the rain fell, they fell with it. Every time someone else tried to commit murder during a storm, they were there to witness and remember. Lisa stepped toward me through the ankle-deep blood that now covered my floor. Her chest cavity opened like a flower, ribs spread wide to reveal organs that pulsed with their own dark rhythm. But she wasn't alone anymore. Other figures emerged from the red rain. Other victims of other storms. Other secrets that had been buried in hurricane graveyards. A man with his head split open by an axe. A woman with her throat slit so deep her head hung at an impossible angle. Children who'd been drowned in bathtubs while their parents claimed they'd been swept away by flood surge. All of them, standing in my living room, all of them staring at me with eyes that held the fury of every storm that had ever been used to hide atrocity. "The photographs are safe," Lisa said, blood streaming from her mouth like a waterfall. "But they don't matter anymore, because the hurricane has better evidence now. It has you. It has this moment. It has the truth about what really happened in this room." The walls of my house began to bend inward, not from wind pressure, but from something else. Something that wanted to compress this space, to fold it up and carry it away as part of the storm's permanent collection. I was being absorbed into the hurricane itself, becoming part of its memory, another scene it would replay every time it made landfall. I tried to run. I tried to push past the crowd of mutilated corpses that blocked my path to the door, but my feet were stuck in blood that had turned thick as concrete. The red rain kept falling, harder now, washing away everything except the evidence of what I'd done. The chainsaw in my hands began to restart itself, engine turning over without anyone pulling the cord, blade spinning with mechanical hunger that matched my own, but now it was pointing at me, somehow turned around in my grip, the teeth gnashing inches from my own chest. "Your turn," Lisa said, her voice mixing with the hurricane wind until I couldn't tell where her words ended and the storm began. "Your turn to see what it feels like, to understand what you did, to become part of the collection." The spinning blade touched my shirt, then my skin, then my ribs, cutting through me with the same wet cardboard sound I'd heard when I'd opened Lisa up like a Christmas present. But I didn't die. couldn't die, because the storm wouldn't let me. Instead, I joined the others, standing in blood-red rain that fell in rooms where people thought they could hide murder and natural disaster, watching other men make the same choice I'd made, learning that some storms remember everything, collect everything, preserve everything for replay during the next hurricane season. The house dissolved around us, carried away by winds that howled with the voices of everyone who'd ever been killed during a storm. But we remained, the victims and the perpetrators together, frozen in the moment of violence, part of the hurricane's permanent memory bank. Now when Delilah makes landfall, when the wind screams and the rain falls red, we're there in every room where someone thinks they can commit murder and blame it on the weather. We're there to witness, to remember, to collect the evidence that wind and rain preserve better than any crime scene photographer. Lisa stands next to me in the eye of every storm, chest open like a book written in blood and bone, reading the secrets that people try to bury in hurricane graves. And beside her stand all the others, all the victims of all the storms, all the proof that some crimes are too horrible to stay hidden even in Category 5 chaos. The chainsaw runs constantly now, powered by wind and fury, and the accumulated rage of everyone who's ever been murdered during a hurricane. Its blade cuts through more than flesh, cuts through lies, through alibis, through the illusion that natural disasters can hide unnatural crimes. We're coming with the next storm, riding the wind, falling with the rain, bringing the evidence that never washes away no matter how hard the hurricane blows. Every time someone reaches for a weapon while the weather sirens wail, every time someone thinks they can blame murder on meteorology, every time someone believes that chaos provides perfect cover for killing, we'll be there. In the red rain, in the howling wind, in the bloody puddles that reflect scenes of violence from every storm that's ever made landfall. Because hurricanes don't just destroy evidence, they collect it, preserve it, carry it from coast to coast, until the truth becomes part of the weather itself. Listen to the storm approaching. Really, listen, and you might hear the chainsaw still running, might hear Lisa still screaming my name through lungs flooded with hurricane rain, might hear all of us calling out the names of people who thought they could hide murder in the eye of the storm. The next time you're alone during a hurricane, the next time the power goes out and the wind howls and the rain falls red, remember that some storms remember everything. Some weather collects the worst of human nature and carries it forward, season after season, storm after storm, until every hurricane becomes a mobile crime scene that never closes. We're in the wind now. We're in the rain. We're in every room where someone's about to make the same choice I made. And we're bringing the evidence that proves some secrets are too heavy even for Category 5 winds to blow away. The storm is coming. Can you hear it? Can you hear the chainsaw? Can you hear Lisa calling your name through the hurricane? Asking if you're ready to join our collection? Asking if you're prepared to become part of the weather that remembers everything and forgives nothing? Hurricane season never really ends. It just moves from place to place, carrying us with it, carrying the truth that some people tried to bury in storm graves, carrying the proof that murder doesn't wash away no matter how hard the rain falls. We'll see you in the eye of the storm, where the wind stops howling long enough for screams to be heard clearly, where the rain falls red with the blood of everyone who thought they could hide killing in hurricane chaos, where the chainsaw keeps running and running and running forever. The floodwater was boiling my skin off in strips as I clawed my way up the subway tunnel stairs. But when I looked back, my own reflection was swimming toward me through the scalding water with its mouth sewn shut and its eyes carved out. I'd been working the late shift for the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 8 years. Maintenance crew, tunnel inspection, the kind of job nobody thinks about until the trains stop running. Tuesday night started like any other. Routine check of the drainage systems after 3 days of torrential rain had flooded half the subway lines in the city. The storm had been unprecedented. Meteorologists calling it a once-in-a-century event. The kind of downpour that turned streets into rivers and subway tunnels into death traps. Most of the system had been shut down as a precaution, but someone still needed to check the pumps, make sure the tunnels didn't flood permanently, ensure the city could get back to normal once the rain stopped. That someone was me. The water had been ankle deep when I first descended into the 40-ton street tunnel. Warm, but not unusually so for standing water in summer. The drainage pumps were working overtime, mechanical hearts trying to keep the arteries of the city flowing, but they were losing the battle against the sheer volume of water pouring down from the streets above. I'd been checking pump stations for 2 hours when I noticed the temperature rising. Not gradually, not the slow warming you'd expect from mechanical systems working at capacity, but sudden, dramatic heat that made the tunnel air shimmer like desert mirages. The water around my boots began to bubble. Not the gentle percolation of normal drainage, but violent churning that reminded me of soup boiling over on a stove. Steam rose from the surface in thick clouds that carried the unmistakable smell of sulfur, of things burning in places where fire shouldn't exist. I tried to radio for backup, tried to call the surface, but my equipment was malfunctioning. Static filled the airwaves, not random interference, but organized noise that sounded almost like voices speaking in languages that hurt my ears to hear. That's when the water level started rising faster than physics should allow. Not the gradual accumulation of storm runoff, but rapid flooding that seemed to pour from the tunnel walls themselves, from cracks and crevices that glowed with internal heat. Within minutes, the water had reached my waist, scalding hot now. Hot enough that I could feel my uniform starting to dissolve, my skin beginning to blister under the synthetic fabric. But I couldn't climb out, not yet, because something was moving in the water behind me. At first, I thought it was debris, chunks of concrete or metal swept along by the current. But as the heat intensified and my vision began to blur from pain and steam, I realized the shapes had purpose, intention, the deliberate movements of something swimming through water that should have been too hot for any living thing to survive. I turned to get a better look and saw myself, not a reflection in the water's surface, but an actual duplicate swimming through the scalding flood with powerful strokes. Except this version was wrong. Fundamentally altered, mouth sealed shut with what looked like industrial thread, eye sockets carved out and filled with the same glowing heat that emanated from the tunnel walls. The sight should have been impossible, should have triggered rational explanations about heat hallucinations or equipment malfunctions. Instead, I found myself backing toward the nearest stairwell, toward escape routes that led to street level, toward air that didn't taste like burning metal and human flesh. But my doppelganger was faster, swimming through boiling water as if it were cool spring rain, closing the distance between us with predatory efficiency. When it surfaced near the tunnel platform, I could see that its skin had been stripped away in precise patterns, not random damage from heat, but deliberate mutilation that revealed musculature and bone in geometric designs. "You're not supposed to be down here," I heard myself say. Except the voice came from the sewn-shut mouth of my duplicate, came from vocal cords that shouldn't have been able to function, came from a throat that had been modified for purposes I didn't want to understand. The boiling water continued to rise, now chest deep, hot enough that my flesh was literally cooking, peeling away in strips that floated on the surface like some horrible soup. But I couldn't die, couldn't lose consciousness, couldn't escape the pain that was reshaping me into something that could survive in conditions that should have killed me instantly. The tunnels have been closed, My duplicate continued, swimming in lazy circles around my position, close to living things, close to people who still have skin, close to anyone who hasn't been prepared for the new conditions. I reached the stairwell, metal steps that led upward toward street level, toward safety, toward air that wouldn't strip flesh from bone with every breath. But when I tried to climb, when I lifted my foot toward the first step, my leg came apart in my hands, not cut, not broken, just separated, as if the superheated water had dissolved whatever held my body together, as if I was becoming liquid myself, losing cohesion in the same way my reflection had gained it. The city is changing, my duplicate said, now close enough that I could see the careful stitching that held its mouth closed, could see the precise edges where its eyes had been carved away. He could see that its wounds weren't injuries but modifications. The rain isn't stopping. The heat isn't cooling. The tunnels aren't draining. I looked around the flooded platform and realized it was true. None of this was accidental. The boiling water wasn't a malfunction. It was an installation. The rising temperature wasn't equipment failure. It was environmental control. The flooding wasn't storm damage. It was flooding by design. How long? I managed to ask, though my voice came out as steam, as vapor that condensed on the tunnel walls in patterns that looked almost like writing. Since the first subway was built, my duplicate replied, swimming closer, reaching out with hands that ended in exposed bone, fingers that had been stripped down to their essential function. Every tunnel, every platform, every mile of track, all designed to serve a purpose that has nothing to do with transportation. The truth hit me like the superheated water that was dissolving my flesh. The realization that the subway system wasn't infrastructure but digestive tract, that the tunnels weren't passages but arteries, that the city above wasn't built on solid ground but on the back of something vast and hungry that had been feeding on commuters for over a century. The passengers, I whispered, thinking of all the people I'd seen disappearing into tunnels over the years, all the missing person reports that got filed and forgotten, all the unexplained delays and service interruptions that stranded people in underground spaces for hours at a time. Nutrition, my duplicate confirmed, now close enough to touch, to grab, to pull me deeper into water that was hot enough to liquefy bone. But maintenance workers, people who understand the system, people who keep it functioning, you're different. You're not food. You're potential. I felt its hands, my hands, close around my dissolving arms, felt myself being pulled deeper into the scalding flood that was transforming me into something that could survive in these conditions. The pain was beyond description, beyond human capacity for suffering. But I wasn't dying. I was changing. My skin peeled away completely, revealing musculature that pulsed with the same internal heat as the tunnel walls. My eyes dissolved, but new senses opened, ways of perceiving that didn't require light or vision. My mouth sealed itself, threads growing from my own flesh. But communication became telepathic, direct, more efficient than speech. Welcome to the real transit system, my duplicate, my predecessor, my future self, said without speaking. Welcome to the job you were always meant to do. I understood then that every maintenance worker eventually made this transition, that the subway system required staff who could function in conditions that would kill normal humans, that the city's underground infrastructure was maintained by people who'd been boiled down to their essential components and rebuilt for specialized purposes. The floodwater was cooling now, not because the heat was dissipating, but because my new physiology could tolerate temperatures that would have killed my previous form. I could see clearly despite having no eyes. I could navigate the tunnels despite the absence of light, could understand the true layout of the system that existed beneath the maps civilians were allowed to see. Miles of additional tunnels, platforms that didn't appear on any official diagram, stations where things that had once been passengers waited for trains that would take them to destinations that existed only in the digestive system of something too large to comprehend. And all of it maintained by workers like me, like what I'd become, like what I'd always been intended to become. "Your shift starts now," my predecessor said, swimming away through water that would boil any living thing but felt perfectly comfortable against my new anatomy. The real shift, maintaining the systems that keep the city fed, keeping the tunnels flowing, making sure the passengers reach their final destinations. I descended deeper into the subway system, past levels that tourists would never see, past platforms where commuters from decades past still waited for trains that had already arrived and departed, past evidence of what really happened to people who entered tunnels and never emerged. The storm above continued, rain falling in patterns that guided surface dwellers toward subway entrances, toward underground spaces where they would contribute to the nutrition cycle that kept the city's true infrastructure functioning. But now I was part of that system, part of the maintenance crew that ensured everything operated smoothly. My radio crackled back to life, not with surface communication, but with dispatches from other maintenance workers, other people who'd made the transition, other employees of a transit authority that served passengers in ways they never understood. "Platform 7 needs cleaning," came a voice that might have been human once. "Fresh arrivals from the evening rush. Standard processing required. Pump station 12 is backed up," reported another. "Digestive overflow from the weekend accumulation. Bring the heavy equipment. New worker in Tunnel 4, announced a third. Transition complete. Ready for orientation. That was me. The new worker. The fresh addition to a maintenance crew that kept the city's hunger satisfied, that ensured the subway system continued to serve its true purpose beneath the illusion of public transportation. I swam through the boiling water toward my first assignment, toward platforms where passengers waited with the infinite patience of people who'd already arrived at their final destination, toward work that would last as long as the city existed, as long as people continued to descend into tunnels that led deeper than any map could show. The rain above will keep falling, drawing more passengers into the underground, providing fresh nutrition for the system that digests them so efficiently that their disappearances barely register as statistics. Missing person reports filed and forgotten. Unexplained absences attributed to big city anonymity. People who vanished into subway tunnels that exist to make people vanish. But the trains keep running. The lights stay on. The platforms remain clean. Because maintenance workers like me keep everything functioning perfectly. Workers who've been boiled down to their essential components, who've been rebuilt for specialized tasks, who understand that some jobs require sacrificing your human form to perform them properly. Listen to the rain. Really listen. And you might hear it calling you toward subway entrances, toward tunnels that will take you exactly where you need to go, toward platforms where you'll wait for trains that always arrive on schedule, toward a transit system that serves passengers in ways they never expect. The water is warm down here, warmer than it should be, warm enough to change you, to prepare you, to make you suitable for whatever role the system needs you to fill. Some people become passengers, some become maintenance staff, but everyone who enters these tunnels becomes part of something larger than individual existence. The subway is calling, and can you hear it through the storm? Can you hear the trains approaching? The platforms calling for passengers? The tunnels that need maintenance workers who understand that some jobs require complete transformation, complete dedication, complete dissolution of whatever you used to be, come underground. Bring your transit card. Bring your willingness to serve. Bring your capacity for change. Because the city's hunger never stops. The trains never stop running. And the maintenance crew always needs new workers who understand that keeping the system functional is more important than keeping your original form. The flood is rising. The heat is building. The transformation is waiting. And the tunnels that exist beneath the tunnels are calling for people who are ready to become something more than human. Something more useful. Something that can survive in boiling water and maintain systems that digest cities from below. Welcome to the real Transit Authority. Enjoy your eternal shift. The trains are always on time when you're working to keep them that way. The scalpel sliced through my forearm like butter, blood pooling on the morgue table, but I couldn't feel any pain because I was watching myself from across the room. I'd been working the graveyard shift at County General's morgue for 8 months. Not exactly the career path I'd planned when I graduated with my forensic science degree, but student loans don't pay themselves. The overnight hours suited me fine. Less supervision, more overtime pay, and the dead don't complain about bedside manner. That Tuesday started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., checked the intake log. 3 bodies waiting for processing. A car accident victim, an elderly woman who'd passed in her sleep, and a John Doe they'd pulled from the river that afternoon. Standard Tuesday night in the city. The morgue felt different that evening, though. Heavier somehow. The fluorescent lights hummed with an irregular frequency that made my teeth ache, and the air conditioning cycled on and off in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I'd worked alone in this basement for months without feeling spooked, but tonight every shadow seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I started with the car accident victim, routine external examination, photographing injuries, collecting samples, everything by the book. But when I reached for my camera to document the trauma patterns, my hands were shaking, not from nerves. I'd seen worse. This was different. Like my body was responding to something my conscious mind hadn't recognized yet. The elderly woman came next. Peaceful face. Natural death. No signs of trauma. But as I prepared her for the autopsy, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Her eyes were open, just slightly, and they seemed to track my movement around the table. Post-mortem muscle spasms, I told myself. Happens all the time, except it doesn't. Not like this. I tried to close her eyelids, but they kept drifting open, always following me, always watching. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and my breath began to mist despite the climate control reading 72 degrees. Something was wrong, fundamentally, impossibly wrong, but I had a job to finish. The John Doe was the worst of the 3. Waterlogged, decomposed, facial features distorted beyond recognition. The police report said he'd been in the river for at least a week, but when I touched his skin to begin the examination, it was warm. Not room temperature warm, body temperature warm, as if blood was still circulating beneath the surface. I checked the thermometer. 98.6 degrees. Impossible. Dead bodies don't maintain core temperature, especially not after a week in cold river water. But there it was. Warm flesh under my gloves, and something that felt disturbingly like a pulse when I pressed my fingers to his neck. That's when I heard the breathing. Soft, at first. Barely audible over the morgue's mechanical sounds, but growing steadier. More pronounced, coming from all 3 tables at once. I stood frozen in the center of the room, listening to 3 dead bodies breathe in perfect synchronization, a chorus of the impossible that made my skin crawl and my vision blur at the edges. I should have called security, should have run, should have done anything except what I actually did. Instead, I grabbed a scalpel from the instrument tray and approached the John Doe, if he was somehow still alive. If this was all some terrible mistake, I needed to know. The blade felt heavier than usual in my hand, weighted with significance I couldn't understand. I positioned it over his chest, right where the heart would be, and pressed down. The skin parted easily, too easily, like cutting through warm butter instead of human tissue. But no blood flowed from the incision. Instead, something else began to seep out. A thick, dark substance that wasn't quite liquid, wasn't quite gas. It rose from the wound like smoke, carrying with it the most horrifying stench I'd ever encountered. Not decay, not death, but something older and more primal. The substance began to take shape in the air above the table. Humanoid, but wrong. Proportions that hurt to look at directly. And as it solidified, I felt something incredible happen to my own body. A tugging sensation, like being pulled in two different directions at once. And suddenly, I was looking down at myself from near the ceiling. My physical body stood at the table, scalpel still in hand, but I was floating above it all, watching myself work with mechanical precision on the John Doe's corpse. My hands moved without conscious direction, making incisions I'd never learned, removing organs and patterns that defied medical training. I tried to scream, but I had no voice in this disembodied state. Tried to move, but I was anchored to the ceiling by invisible chains. All I could do was watch as my body continued its impossible work. And as the other two corpses began to sit up on their tables, the elderly woman's eyes were wide open now, not tracking anymore, but boring into me with accusatory intensity. The car accident victim turned his shattered head toward my floating consciousness and smiled with lips that had been torn away in the crash. And through it all, my body kept working, kept cutting, kept releasing more of that horrible dark substance into the morgue's recycled air. The breathing grew louder, more insistent, no longer coming from the bodies but from the substance itself as it expanded throughout the room. Each inhalation seemed to pull something vital from my floating form. Memories, personality, the very essence of what made me human. I began to understand what was happening, what had probably been happening for months without my knowledge. The night shift wasn't just about processing the dead. It was about feeding something that existed in the spaces between life and death, something that needed fresh consciousness to sustain itself. And I'd been the perfect unwitting accomplice. My floating awareness grew weaker as my physical body continued its work. I could feel myself being absorbed into that dark substance, becoming part of whatever intelligence guided it. Soon there would be nothing left of my original consciousness except the mechanical shell that showed up for work each night, that processed bodies with inhuman efficiency, that never questioned why certain corpses maintained body temperature, or why the dead sometimes opened their eyes. As my vision began to fade, I saw my physical body turn toward the morgue's entrance where a new figure stood watching. Another night shift worker, probably, drawn by the sounds or the smell. Fresh consciousness for the feeding. Another unwitting participant in this impossible harvest. The last thing I remembered was my body raising the bloody scalpel in greeting, and the newcomer's face changing from confusion to terror as they realized what they were seeing. Then darkness claimed my floating awareness, and I became part of the hungry intelligence that lurked in the morgue's shadows. When I woke up, if waking is the right word, I was back in my physical body, standing at the first table with the scalpel in my hand. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m., but I had no memory of the previous 4 hours. The three bodies lay exactly as they should. No impossible warmth, no breathing, no accusatory stares, just corpses waiting to be processed. The incident report I filed that morning mentioned equipment malfunctions, temperature readings, flickering lights, that sort of thing. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever questions what happens during the night shift in a place where the living don't want to linger, but I know the truth now, or at least part of it. Something feeds in that basement. Something that's been feeding for longer than I've worked there. It uses the night shift workers as its hands, its tools for processing the dead in ways that have nothing to do with medical examination. And the worst part? I think I'm starting to like it. The work feels natural now, instinctive. My hands know exactly where to make each incision, exactly how to release whatever essence lingers in recently deceased tissue. The dark substance doesn't frighten me anymore. It welcomes me, makes me feel part of something larger and more important than forensic science. Sometimes I catch myself looking forward to the difficult cases, the violent deaths, the mysterious circumstances, the bodies that arrive with questions that will never be answered. Those are the ones that feed the darkness most effectively, the ones that carry the strongest remnants of life. I've been watching the other night shift workers too, seeing the same mechanical precision in their movements, the same empty satisfaction in their eyes. We're all part of it now, all contributing to something we don't fully understand but can't resist. The day shift workers don't see what we see, don't feel what we feel. They process their bodies with clinical detachment, following procedures, filling out forms. But they don't understand that death isn't an ending, it's a transition. And some transitions require assistance. If you're listening to this, if you work nights anywhere the dead are stored, pay attention to the small things, the temperature fluctuations, the sounds that don't belong, the way shadows seem to move independently of their sources. And if you ever find yourself holding a scalpel over a body that feels too warm, if you ever see your reflection in polished metal and notice it's doing things you don't remember, if you ever lose hours and wake up with blood under your fingernails that isn't your own, remember that some jobs change you in ways that go deeper than experience. Some work leaves marks on your soul that don't wash off at the end of a shift. And some darkness, once it knows your name, never lets you clock out. The morgue is calling. Can you hear it? That steady mechanical breathing of the ventilation system that sounds almost alive? The soft whisper of fluorescent lights that might be trying to tell you something? Listen carefully, because once you start hearing what the night shift really wants you to hear, once you understand what those bodies are really waiting for, you'll realize that some stories are best told in the dark, to people who understand that death is just another kind of work, and work, well, work never really ends. The machete split her skull down to the teeth as lightning illuminated the flooded cabin, but when I pulled the blade free, maggots poured out of the wound instead of blood, and she smiled at me with half a face. The lake house had been our weekend retreat for 15 years. A place where corporate stress dissolved into fishing trips and barbecues, where my wife Emma could paint watercolors on the deck while I pretended to read novels I never finished. But 3 months ago, everything changed when I found those photographs hidden in her art supplies, pictures of her with him, Marcus from her office, in positions that made my stomach burn with rage and humiliation, dozens of them, dating back 2 years, detailed documentation of an affair I'd been too blind and trusting to notice. The storm had been building all day, one of those summer tempests that turned the lake into a churning cauldron while rain hammers the cabin roof like machine gun fire. Perfect conditions for what I had planned. What I'd been planning since I discovered those photographs 3 months ago. Emma was in the kitchen making dinner, humming that song she always hummed when she was happy, probably thinking about Marcus while she chopped vegetables for a romantic meal she assumed we'd share. The machete sat heavy in my hands. 2 feet of sharpened steel I'd bought for clearing brush but never used for its intended purpose. "The storm's getting worse," she called out, oblivious to my approach. "We might lose power soon. Good thing I started dinner early. The first blow caught her across the back of the neck, not deep enough to sever her spine completely, but sufficient to drop her to the kitchen floor in convulsions. Blood sprayed across the cabinet doors, across the photographs of our happy marriage that I'd been staring at for months while knowing they were all lies. But when she rolled over to face me, when the lightning flashed and illuminated her face, something was wrong beyond the gaping wound I'd just inflicted. Her eyes were white, completely white, like hard-boiled eggs pressed into her skull, and her mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear over the storm. I raised the machete again, brought it down with all the rage I'd been carrying for 3 months, felt the blade bite deep into her forehead and split her skull like a melon. But instead of brains and blood, insects poured out. Thousands of writhing maggots that scattered across the kitchen floor with purposeful movement. She was still smiling, still trying to speak through a mouth filled with larvae and decomposed tissue. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering against windows with such force that the glass began to crack, water seeping through gaps in the walls that shouldn't have existed. "David," she whispered, though her voice came from the maggots themselves rather than her ruined throat. "David, you're too late." Too late for what? Too late to save our marriage? Too late to confront her about the affair before it destroyed us both? Too late to realize that revenge would feel empty even when served with maximum brutality? The cabin began to flood. Not from outside water, but from something else. Something dark and viscous that seeped up through the floorboards. It smelled like decay, like things that had been rotting at the bottom of the lake for decades, like secrets that had been buried too deep and too long to stay hidden. Emma's body, what was left of it, began to change shape. Her limbs stretched, elongated, twisted into configurations that human bones shouldn't achieve. The maggots that had spilled from her skull crawled back into the wound and began rebuilding her, not as she had been, but as something else. Something that had been waiting beneath the lake's surface for the right storm to bring it home. The photographs, she said, her voice clearer now despite having no tongue, were meant for you to find. I backed away from the thing that had been my wife, machete still clutched in hands that were shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip. The dark water around my ankles was rising. Not just water now, but a soup of decomposed organic matter that clung to my legs like liquid cement, meant for me to find. I stammered. "You wanted me to know about the affair." Her reconstructed face, half familiar flesh, half writhing insects, smiled with genuine warmth. Not affair. Invitation. You were supposed to come to the lake. The truth hit me like the lightning that was now striking the cabin's roof with mechanical regularity. Every bolt illuminated more details I'd missed, more evidence of how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. The photographs hadn't been hidden. They'd been placed exactly where I would find them. The affair with Marcus hadn't been secret. It had been bait. How long? I whispered, though I dreaded the answer. 15 years. She replied, maggots spilling from her mouth with each word. 15 years of weekends at the lake. 15 years of feeding. What lives in the deep water? The cabin shuddered under the storm's assault, walls bending inward, roof tiles flying away. But the structure wasn't being destroyed by weather. It was being absorbed, drawn down into whatever depths existed beneath the lake's surface. Emma's transformed body began to sink into the dark water, not drowning, but descending with purpose, beckoning me to follow with gestures that were part human, part something else entirely. The machete felt useless in my hands now, less weapon than prop in a performance I'd never understood I was giving. "The others," she said, pointing toward the cabin's windows, "are waiting." I looked outside and saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the storm-lashed water that now surrounded the cabin. Men and women I didn't recognize, but who seemed familiar in ways I couldn't explain. All of them bearing wounds, machete cuts, axe blows, gunshot holes. All of them smiling with the same maggot-filled mouths. "Weekend guests," Emma explained. "From other lake houses, other storms, other husbands who found photographs of affairs that were meant to bring them here." The pattern became clear with horrible inevitability. How many men had stood where I was standing, holding weapons they thought would solve their problems, discovering too late that their marital problems had been manufactured to bring them to this exact moment in this exact place during this exact kind of storm. The lake house wasn't our weekend retreat. It was a trap. Emma wasn't my wife. She was bait. The photographs weren't evidence of betrayal. They were instructions that had guided me through 15 years of weekend visits until I was ready to take the final step, until I was angry enough to bring a machete to what I thought would be a confrontation about infidelity. "What are you?" I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind like maggots in a wound. "Hunger," she replied, sinking deeper into the dark water. "Hunger that feeds on rage, on betrayal, on the moment when love becomes violence." The cabin tilted, sliding sideways into the lake as whatever force had been holding it above water finally let go. But we weren't sinking. We were descending, passing through layers of water that shouldn't exist, past the drowned remains of other lake houses, other weekend retreats where other husbands had discovered other affairs that had led them to the same bloody conclusion. The machete was dissolving in my hands, metal becoming liquid, liquid becoming part of the dark soup that surrounded us. But I could still feel it, still feel the weight of violence I'd committed. Still feel the moment when love had transformed into something that fed whatever lived in these impossible depths. Emma, or the thing that had worn Emma's shape for 15 years, was changing again. Her human features melted away completely, revealing something that had never been human, something that existed only to create the conditions necessary for its own feeding. Betrayal was just seasoning. Rage was just preparation. Violence was just the moment when the meal became ready for consumption. "Marcus," I said, understanding finally dawning. "Was he even real?" She laughed, a sound like bubbles rising from deep water. "Real enough to serve his purpose. Real enough to make you feel what we needed you to feel." The cabin settled into its final position, not on the lake bottom, but in some space that existed between the surface and the depths, between the living world and whatever realm this thing called home. Around us, the other weekend guests stood in perfect formation, other husbands who'd followed the same path, who'd discovered the same photographs, who'd brought the same weapons to the same kind of storm. "Welcome," Emma said, her voice now coming from the water itself, to the real lake house. I looked around at what had become my permanent residence, at the men who'd made the same choices I'd made, at the evidence that some weekend retreats never end, some storms never pass, some marriages are designed to culminate in exactly this kind of violence. The machete reformed in my hands, whole again, sharp again, hungry again, because this wasn't ending. This was beginning. Somewhere above us, another couple was probably driving toward another lake house. Another husband was probably about to find photographs of another affair. Another storm was probably building to provide the perfect cover for another act of perfectly orchestrated rage. Your turn, Emma said, pointing upward through the dark water toward lights that might have been another cabin, another weekend retreat, another trap disguised as marital bliss. Help. Us. Feed. I understood then that I wasn't just a victim of this thing's hunger. I was part of it now. Part of the cycle that drew betrayed husbands to lake houses during storms. Part of the mechanism that transformed love into violence, into sustenance for something that existed only to create and consume human rage. The storm above us was already calling. Another weekend, another couple, another husband about to discover photographs that had been placed exactly where he would find them. My role now was to help create the conditions, to be the Marcus in someone else's story, to provide the betrayal that would season another meal. I swam upward through the dark water, machete in hand, ready to play my part in the cycle that had consumed me, ready to help manufacture the affair that would drive another husband to violence, ready to feed the hunger that had been feeding on marital rage since the first lake house was built beside the first dark water. Emma swam beside me, no longer my wife, no longer pretending to be human, just hunger wearing whatever shape was necessary to lure the next victim to the next weekend retreat. Together, we rose toward the surface, toward the storm, toward the next couple who thought they were just taking a romantic getaway to a peaceful lake house. The rain above us was already falling, calling to men who'd recently discovered evidence of affairs they didn't know had been manufactured specifically for them. The storm was building, creating the perfect conditions for violence, for revelation, for the moment when love transforms into something that can be consumed by the things that live in dark water. We're coming to the surface now. Emma and I and all the other weekend guests, rising with the storm, ready to play our roles in the next act of this endless performance, ready to create another affair, another discovery, another night when a machete splits a skull and maggots pour out instead of blood. The lake house is calling. Can you hear it through the rain? Can you hear the storm building? The perfect weather for weekend getaways, for romantic retreats, for the kind of marital confrontations that feed things older and hungrier than human emotion. Listen to the rain. Really listen. And you might hear the whispers of couples planning their next trip to the lake. Might hear husbands discovering photographs they were meant to find. Might hear the splash of machetes entering dark water, where they'll wait for the next storm, the next weekend, the next feeding. We're all weekend guests now, permanent residents of lake houses that exist between surface and depth, between love and violence, between the storms that bring couples together and the storms that tear them apart in exactly the ways that something inhuman needs them to be torn apart. The water is calling. The storm is building. The photographs are already hidden where the next husband will find them, and the machete is sharp and ready for another weekend at the lake house where marriages go to die and where the dead go to feed what has always been hungry, always waiting, always ready for the next romantic getaway that ends in screams and maggots and the sound of rain falling on dark water that remembers everything and forgives nothing. Come to the lake. Bring your wife. Bring your trust. Bring your capacity for rage. Because some weekend retreats last forever, and some lake houses have been waiting specifically for you, for your particular flavor of betrayal, for your particular style of violence. The storm is perfect tonight. Perfect for fishing, perfect for romance, perfect for discovering affairs that were designed to bring you exactly where you need to be, machete in hand. Standing over the thing you thought you loved, ready to feed what has been starving in the deep water, waiting for weekend guests who never quite managed to check out. Welcome to the lake house. Enjoy your stay. It's going to last forever. The crowbar went through his skull with a wet crunch as the storm raged outside, but I kept swinging because the thing wearing my brother's face wouldn't stop crawling toward me through the flooded basement. 3 days of rain had turned our neighborhood into a disaster zone. Streets became rivers, storm drains backed up, and basements across the city started flooding faster than the pumps could handle. I'd been down there trying to save what I could when Danny showed up, except Danny had been dead for 6 months. Car accident last December. Closed casket funeral because there wasn't enough left of his face to make him presentable. I'd identified him by his tattoos and the watch our father gave him for graduation. But now he was crawling through 3 feet of muddy water in my basement, skull caved in on the left side, jaw hanging at an impossible angle, making sounds that might have been my name. The crowbar felt slick in my hands. Rain from the broken basement window mixing with something darker that I didn't want to think about. Each impact sent spray across the concrete walls, painting them with fragments that used to be my little brother's head. Danny's. Dead. I gasped between swings, but the thing just kept coming. Fingers that were too long now, too many joints, digging into the concrete floor for purchase as it hauled itself toward me with mechanical determination. The flooding had started Tuesday morning when the storm hit with unprecedented fury. By evening, half the basement was underwater, and I'd been making trips down there every hour trying to move valuables to higher ground. Photo albums, important documents, the box of Danny's things I hadn't been able to throw away yet. That's when I found him floating face down near the water heater, bloated, waterlogged, wearing the same clothes he died in 6 months ago. The funeral home had buried him in his best suit, but this thing was dressed in the torn jeans and bloody t-shirt from the accident scene. I thought I was hallucinating at first. Grief and stress finally catching up with me in the form of elaborate psychological breakdown. Dead brothers don't just appear in flooded basements. Bodies don't dig themselves out of graves and swim through storm drains to visit their siblings. But when I reached down to check if what I was seeing was real, those waterlogged fingers wrapped around my wrist with crushing strength. The touch was cold. Not just cold, but absent of any warmth that had ever existed. Like touching something that had been frozen at the bottom of a lake for decades. That's when it opened its eyes. Or what was left of them after 6 months in the ground. Milky white orbs that rolled independently of each other. One looking at me while the other scanned the flooded basement as if searching for something specific. "Michael," it whispered, and the voice was Danny's but wrong, like hearing a recording of someone speaking underwater through damaged speakers. "You left me." I jerked my hand away and scrambled up the basement stairs, but the thing that wore my brother's face followed with surprising speed. Not walking, crawling on its belly like a snake, but fast enough to keep pace with my panicked retreat. The front door was locked. Deadbolt engaged, chain in place, just as I'd left it when I went down to check the basement. But somehow, this thing had gotten inside, had been waiting in the floodwater like a trapdoor spider waiting for prey. I grabbed the crowbar from my toolbox and turned to face whatever had invaded my home. The thing pulled itself up the basement stairs with wet slapping sounds, leaving a trail of muddy water mixed with substances I didn't want to identify. "You promised It continued, dragging itself into my living room with horrible determination. You promised you'd visit Danny's grave. I hadn't been back since the funeral, couldn't handle seeing his name on a headstone, couldn't face the reality that my little brother was rotting in a box while I went on living. Some promises are too painful to keep, but this animated reminder of my failures, it had apparently tired of waiting for me to honor my word. It had dug itself out of consecrated ground, swum through miles of flooded storm drains, and tracked me down to collect on emotional debts I owed to the dead. The first swing of the crowbar caught it in the shoulder, or where the shoulder should have been. The impact sent chunks of waterlogged flesh flying, but the thing didn't even slow down, just kept crawling toward me with that horrible mechanical persistence. 6 months. It gasped, reaching for my ankle with fingers that ended in jagged bone where the nails should have been. 6 months. Alone. I brought the crowbar down again. Harder this time, connecting with the side of its head. The skull gave way with that wet crunch, spraying the walls with brain matter that had turned to gray sludge during its time underground. But it kept moving, kept reaching, kept trying to grab hold of me with desperate hunger. Because this wasn't really about visiting graves or honoring the dead. This was about something darker, something that had been growing in the spaces between guilt and grief, the truth I'd been avoiding since the night Danny died. The real reason I couldn't visit his grave, the secret that had been eating me alive for 6 months while his body decomposed in the ground. I was driving that night. We'd been drinking at Murphy's Bar, celebrating my promotion, drowning our sorrows about Dad's cancer diagnosis, making plans for a future that would never happen. Danny was drunker than me, much drunker. But I was tired and my vision was blurry, and I made a choice that killed my little brother. I let him drive because I was too proud to admit I was intoxicated, too embarrassed to call a cab or ask someone else for help. I handed him the keys and climbed into the passenger seat and closed my eyes while he drove us toward the intersection where a semi-truck was running a red light. The impact threw me clear. Lucky trajectory, the paramedic said. Danny wasn't so fortunate. The steering wheel crushed his chest. The dashboard caved in his skull, and I walked away with cuts and bruises while he died screaming my name. The police report blamed mechanical failure. Faulty brakes, they said. Tragic accident, they said. No charges filed, they said. But I knew the truth, knew that if I'd been sober enough to drive, if I'd been strong enough to take the keys away from him, if I'd been a better brother instead of a selfish coward, Danny would still be alive. And now he was here. Or something wearing his shape was here, crawling through the floodwater of my basement because the dead don't stay buried when the living refuse to carry their proper share of guilt. I kept swinging the crowbar. I kept destroying what was left of my brother's face. But with each impact, more details became clear. The way his fingers were positioned exactly as they'd been on the steering wheel, the angle of his neck, the same impossible twist from where the dashboard had caught him. This wasn't Danny returned from the grave. This was my guilt made manifest, my shame given physical form by 6 months of self-hatred, and the kind of rain that washes away everything except the things you most want to forget. You killed me, it whispered through a mouth full of broken teeth and cemetery soil. You killed me, and you won't even visit. The crowbar connected again, and again, and again, until there was nothing left that resembled a human head. Just pulverized bone and rotting flesh scattered across my living room floor while storm water continued to pour through windows I didn't remember opening. But the voice kept coming, not from the destroyed corpse anymore, but from the rain itself, from every drop that fell against my windows, every rivulet that ran down my walls, every puddle that formed on my hardwood floors. Visit me, Michael. Visit me, or I'll keep coming back. The flooding intensified, not just in the basement now, but throughout the entire house. Water rose from drains, seeped through walls, fell from the ceiling in torrents that defied physics. And in every reflection, on every wet surface, I could see Danny's face, whole again, accusing, waiting. I dropped the crowbar and waded through the rising water toward my front door. But the handle wouldn't turn. The lock had somehow fused itself, melted and reformed into solid metal that no key could open. I was trapped in my own home with the remains of whatever I'd just destroyed, and the growing certainty that destroying it hadn't solved anything. The water kept rising. 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, until I was treading desperately in the center of my living room, while rain continued to pour through openings that shouldn't exist. And in that dark water, I could feel things moving, soft, bloated things that brushed against my legs with familiar touches. Not just Danny now, but everyone I'd ever failed, everyone I'd let down, everyone whose death I'd played a role in through action or inaction. They were all swimming up from whatever depths guilt creates when it ferments in isolation. Dad, who died of cancer while I was too busy feeling sorry for myself to visit him properly. Mom, who'd had a stroke during the stress of planning Danny's funeral. College roommate who'd overdosed after I'd refused to drive him to rehab because I was afraid of being associated with his problems. All of them rising from the floodwater with accusations in their eyes and crowbar wounds in their skulls. Because guilt, once it takes physical form, spreads like infection through every relationship you've ever damaged. I went under, swallowed mouthfuls of water that tasted like cemetery soil, and regret, felt those familiar hands pulling me down toward whatever judgment waited at the bottom of my subconscious. This was how it ended. Not with redemption or forgiveness, but with drowning in the consequences of choices I'd made when I thought nobody would ever have to pay the real price. But somehow, impossibly, I surfaced again, gasping, choking, alive despite the hands that had been dragging me toward permanent absolution. Flowing back toward drains and cracks and the spaces between reality and nightmare, the living room looked normal again. No blood on the walls, no fragments of skull on the furniture, no evidence that I'd spent the night beating my dead brother to pieces with a crowbar. Just a dry, clean space that showed no signs of flooding despite the storm still raging outside. But on my coffee table, dry and perfectly preserved despite everything that had happened, was Danny's funeral program. The one I'd kept but never opened, never read, never used to actually process his death in any meaningful way. Inside the folded paper, someone had written an address in familiar handwriting. Hillcrest Cemetery, Section 7, Plot 23, Danny's grave. The place I'd been avoiding for 6 months. The destination I'd promised to visit but never found the courage to approach. The storm was finally beginning to break as dawn approached. Lighter rain now, gentler sounds against my windows. But I knew this was just a temporary reprieve. The dead don't stop visiting just because you destroy their physical manifestations. They keep coming back until you honor the promises you made, until you carry the guilt to the places where it belongs, until you stop trying to bury your failures in the same ground where you buried the people you failed. I got dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, grabbed my keys, my wallet, the funeral program with its handwritten directions. The cemetery would be muddy after 3 days of flooding, but Danny had been waiting in worse conditions for much longer. It was time to visit, time to admit what really happened that night, time to stop letting the dead crawl through storm drains when they should be resting in peace. Because some promises are too important to break, even when keeping them means facing truths that are more horrifying than any corpse that crawls out of a flooded basement. Even when forgiveness requires admitting guilt that's been rotting inside you longer than your brother's been rotting in the ground, the rain knows where the guilty live, knows which storms will bring the dead back for collection, knows that some debts can only be paid with visits to places where the living prefer not to go. But sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to face what you've done, and strong enough to carry the weight of real responsibility, sometimes the dead will finally stay buried, and sometimes the rain will wash away the guilt instead of bringing it back to life. Listen to the storm. Really, listen. And you might hear the voices of everyone you've ever failed calling your name through the downpour. Don't ignore them. Don't try to destroy them with crowbars and denial. Visit them instead. Honor the promises you made when you thought the dead couldn't enforce them. Carry your guilt to the places where it belongs, before it carries you to places you'll never return from. The rain is falling harder now. Can you hear it? Even from the grave. Just to remind you that some promises matter more than the fear of keeping them. Danny's waiting, and the storm's not over yet. I found my neighbor's severed hand clutching my apartment key in the hallway, rain streaming through the broken skylight above, but she was supposed to be on vacation for another week. The storm had been battering Portland for 3 days straight. The kind of relentless Pacific Northwest downpour that turns streets into rivers and makes you forget what dry pavement looks like. I'd been holed up in my apartment, working remotely and listening to the rain drum against my windows with increasing intensity. Sarah from 3B had knocked on my door Monday morning before the weather turned nasty. Bright smile, rolling suitcase, that excited energy people get before vacation. She'd asked me to water her plants while she was in Mexico for 10 days. Handed me her spare key with a laugh about how she always killed her succulents when she traveled. Just twice a week, she'd said, pressing the brass key into my palm. You're a lifesaver, Jake. That was Monday. This was Thursday night, and the storm was finally starting to break, at least according to the weather reports. But the rain kept falling, harder than ever, turning the building's old gutters into waterfalls that cascaded past my 4th floor windows. I'd been planning to check on Sarah's plants that evening. Procrastination is my specialty. When the power went out around 11 p.m., the building's emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in that sickly red glow that makes even familiar spaces feel threatening. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and headed for the hallway, figuring I might as well take care of the plant situation while the power was out. The building felt different in the darkness. Older, more oppressive. The sound of rain echoed through the walls like whispers in a language I didn't understand. That's when I saw it, lying in a pool of rainwater at the base of the stairwell. Pale fingers wrapped around something metallic. My brain refused to process what I was seeing at first. Just registered object on floor. Investigate later. But as I got closer, the details became impossible to ignore. It was a human hand, severed cleanly at the wrist, fingers locked in a death grip around my apartment key. Sarah's key, the one she'd given me Monday morning with that bright vacation smile. The rain streaming through the broken skylight above had diluted the blood, creating pink rivulets that flowed toward the storm drain at the hallway's far end, but there was still enough crimson pooled around the hand to make my stomach lurch violently. I should have called 911 immediately. I should have backed away and let the professionals handle whatever horror had invaded my quiet building. Instead, I found myself kneeling in the rainwater, staring at those familiar fingers. The same hands that had knocked on my door 3 days ago. The same silver ring on her middle finger that I'd noticed when she handed me the key. But Sarah was in Mexico. I'd seen her Instagram posts, beach photos, margaritas, sunset selfies. She'd been posting regularly through Wednesday, definitely not in Portland getting dismembered in my apartment building. The hand was warm despite the cold rainwater. Warm and somehow still. Alive isn't the right word, but responsive. When I tried to pry the key from her fingers, they tightened their grip reflexively, as if her severed hand was protecting something important. I managed to work the key free eventually, my own hands shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip. The moment the metal touched my palm, images flooded my mind, flashes of memory that didn't belong to me. Sarah, in her apartment, not packing for vacation, but barricading her door. Sarah at her window, watching something in the courtyard below with growing terror. Sarah backing into her bathroom as wet footsteps approached down the hallway. Footsteps that sounded exactly like the ones I was hearing right now. I spun around, phone light sweeping the corridor, but found only empty space and the steady patter of rain through the broken skylight. The storm drain at the hallway's end gurgled hungrily, swallowing the diluted blood with mechanical efficiency. But the footsteps continued, closer now, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Wet soles on linoleum, leaving tracks that vanished as quickly as they appeared in the emergency lighting's red glow. I ran for my apartment, key clutched in my trembling fist, but when I reached my door, I found it standing wide open. Impossible. I never left my door unlocked, especially not during a power outage in a storm like this. Inside, my apartment looked exactly as I'd left it, except for the wet footprints leading from my entryway to my bedroom. Perfect impressions of bare feet tracking water across my hardwood floors in a path that suggested someone had entered while I was discovering Sarah's hand in the hallway. The footprints were small, feminine, about Sarah's size. But Sarah was in Mexico, posting beach photos and sipping cocktails in the sun. Sarah wasn't leaving wet tracks through my apartment while her severed hand clutched my key in a pool of rainwater downstairs. I followed the trail with growing dread, phone light revealing each perfect footprint in stark detail. They led through my living room, past my kitchen, directly to my bedroom door, which was closed. I never closed my bedroom door. The rain outside intensified, drumming against my windows with renewed fury as if the storm was angry about something. The broken skylight in the hallway allowed water to pour into the building, creating a symphony of drips and splashes that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. I pressed my ear to the bedroom door and heard breathing. Slow, measured respirations that sounded exactly like someone sleeping, but deeper than normal sleep. The kind of breathing that comes from exhaustion or trauma or death. The door handle turned easily in my grip. Too easily, as if it had been oiled recently. The bedroom beyond was dark except for intermittent lightning flashes through my rain-streaked windows. In those brief moments of illumination, I saw my bed, and the shape lying beneath my covers. Someone was in my bed. Someone roughly Sarah's size, lying perfectly still under my blanket with only a cascade of dark hair visible on my pillow. The same dark hair I'd seen in her vacation photos. The same length, same texture, same way of catching light even in darkness. But it couldn't be Sarah. Sarah was 0 miles away, safe in Mexican sunshine, posting updates about resort life and beach adventures. Sarah wasn't lying motionless in my bed while her severed hand clutched my apartment key in the hallway downstairs. I approached slowly, phone light trained on the figure beneath my covers. With each step, more details emerged. The rise and fall of breathing beneath the blanket, the familiar silver bracelet on the visible wrist, even the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she'd told me about months ago. It was Sarah, but it wasn't. Something fundamental was wrong beyond the obvious impossibility of her presence. Her breathing was too slow, too regular, like a machine mimicking human respiration. Her skin had a waxy quality that reflected my phone light in ways that living flesh shouldn't. When I finally worked up the courage to pull back the blanket, what I found underneath made my vision blur and my knees buckle. It was Sarah, but incomplete. Her right hand was missing, severed cleanly at the wrist, leaving a stump that had been cauterized or sealed somehow. No blood, no open wound, just smooth skin where her hand should have been, and her eyes, when they opened and fixed on my face, held no recognition, no consciousness, no spark of the personality I'd known. They were the eyes of someone looking from a great distance, someone who had traveled far beyond normal human experience and couldn't quite find their way back. "You found it," she said, her voice carrying the hollow quality of wind through empty spaces. "You found what I dropped." I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The lock engaged with a solid click, trapping me in the bedroom with whatever Sarah had become during her impossible journey from Mexican beaches to my Portland apartment. "The rain brought me back," she continued, sitting up in my bed with movements that seemed slightly delayed, as if her consciousness was operating her body remotely. "It washes away the boundaries, lets us return from places we're not supposed to leave." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face in stark detail. Beautiful still, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Her features were too sharp, too defined, like a high-resolution photograph of someone rather than the person themselves. "I wasn't in Mexico," she said, reading my confusion with eyes that held too much knowledge. "I was never in Mexico. I've been in the spaces between raindrops, in the moments when lightning bridges sky and earth, in the sound water makes when it's trying to tell you something important." The rain outside reached a crescendo, hammering against my windows with such force that I expected the glass to shatter, but instead of breaking, the windows began to weep. Actual tears of condensation that streamed down the panes in patterns that looked almost like writing. The posts you saw, the photos, the updates. Sarah's incomplete form rose from my bed with fluid grace, all echoes from the storm, reflections of what you expected to see while I was learning to exist in liquid spaces. I pressed myself against the locked door, feeling the vibrations of rain pounding through the building's structure. The storm drain in the hallway gurgled louder now, swallowing more than just diluted blood. It was consuming the boundary between possible and impossible, between the living and whatever Sarah had become. "My hand." She gestured to her sealed stump with casual indifference. "I left it as proof, something solid for you to find. Something to anchor me back to your reality. The key was just convenient." She approached slowly, bare feet silent on my hardwood floors despite the wet tracks she'd left earlier. Each step brought a fresh wave of that impossible wrongness, the sensation of being in the presence of someone who had forgotten how to be human. "The storm is ending," she said, reaching toward me with her remaining hand. "But I don't want to go back to the spaces between raindrops. I want to stay here, in your reality, in your apartment, in your life." Her fingers brushed my cheek, and I felt the crushing cold of deep ocean water, the pressure of being miles underwater where light never reaches. Her touch carried the weight of impossible depths and the suffocating embrace of liquid spaces that weren't meant for human consciousness. "All I need," she whispered, her voice now carrying the sound of rain on different surfaces, on leaves, on pavement, on skin, "is for you to let me stay. To accept that your neighbor returned from vacation, changed, but still Sarah, still the same person who asked you to water her plants." Through my rain-streaked windows, I could see the storm beginning to break. Gaps appeared in the cloud cover, revealing patches of star-filled sky, and with each patch of clear air, Sarah's form became less solid, more translucent, as if she were made of concentrated rainwater held together by will alone. "Decide quickly," she said, her voice becoming harder to distinguish from the sound of water moving through pipes. "The rain that brought me back is ending. Either I anchor myself here, to you, to this place, or I dissolve back into the spaces where dropped water goes before it becomes rain again." The choice should have been obvious. Whatever stood before me wearing Sarah's face wasn't really my neighbor, wasn't really human anymore. It was something that had learned to mimic humanity while swimming through liquid dimensions I couldn't comprehend. But as the storm continued to weaken and her form grew more transparent, I found myself remembering the real Sarah. Her bright vacation smile, her concern for her plants, the way she'd always stop to chat in the hallway even when she was obviously rushing. Maybe this thing wasn't Sarah, but it had her memories, her mannerisms, her genuine care for small living things. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the line between who someone was and who they became wasn't as solid as the boundaries between rain and the spaces it fell through. I reached out and took her remaining hand. I felt it solidify under my touch, watched her features become more defined, more real, more anchored to this reality that still felt like mine. The last of the rain tapered off as dawn approached, and Sarah smiled with genuine warmth that made me forget, momentarily, about the impossible journey she'd taken to return to me, about the hand still clutching my key in the hallway downstairs, about the vacation photos that had never been real. "Thank you," she said, her voice now purely human, no trace of liquid spaces or interdimensional travel. "I promise I'll be a good neighbor. I'll water my plants myself from now on." Outside my windows, the first rays of sunshine broke through dissipating clouds. The storm was over. Sarah was home from her vacation, changed, incomplete but undeniably present in my reality. And if sometimes I notice her moving in ways that remind me of flowing water, if her laughter occasionally sounds like rain on leaves, if she never quite explains what happened to the severed hand that brought us together, well, some storms leave debris that takes time to clean up. Some vacations change you in ways that don't show up in photographs, and some neighbors return from their travels with stories too strange to tell, but too real to doubt. The important thing is that Sarah's back, her plants are thriving, and when the next storm comes, when rain drums against our windows with that familiar intensity, I know I won't be listening to it alone, because some connections survive even the impossible spaces between raindrops. Some friendships anchor themselves so deeply that they transcend the boundaries between human and whatever Sarah became during her time in the liquid spaces. And on nights when the rain falls with particular fury, when storm drains gurgle with mysterious hunger, when you find yourself wondering what really washes away during the heaviest downpours, remember that some things return from their journeys fundamentally changed. Some neighbors come back from vacation with fewer pieces than they left with, and some storms don't just bring rain, they bring back the parts of ourselves we thought we'd lost forever. Listen to the rain. Really listen, and you might hear the echoes of impossible vacations, the whispers of liquid spaces, the sound of consciousness learning to exist in forms that shouldn't be possible. But don't worry, most of what returns with the storm just wants to come home, to anchor itself to familiar places and familiar faces, to remember what it was like to be human, even if it can never quite be human again. The rain knows where you live, and sometimes, just sometimes, it brings back the neighbors you thought you'd never see again.